All right, so they arrive at the beginning of chapter 20 at Kadesh, and then we simply get a statement, Miriam died and was buried there. And it's very stark, right? There's no preamble to it. It's just a very matter of fact. We're going to see later on, probably today, the death of Aaron. And if you compare the death of Aaron to the death of Miriam, it's very dramatic. We're told of the preamble to it. We have a discussion of what happens. We get the people's response. So one of the questions that we'll come to when we talk about Aaron is why he's different. But here it's as if the people really, it's little noted, right? No one says, where is Miriam? What happened to Miriam? Just, she died. Okay, let's move on. And that is really quite striking. And this comes, of course, after a section where we've been talking about death, and we've been talking about impurity that comes from death and how one is cleansed of that impurity. And so it continues that theme, and it also picks up on the theme of water. Miriam, if you think about Miriam's life, she is intimately connected with water. We first see her at the Nile, where Moses has been just an infant, has been placed in a basket, and Miriam is there guarding him on the banks of the Nile and arranges for him to be adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and very cleverly arranges for her mother and Moses's mother to serve as the wet nurse. And then the next time we see her is at the shores of the sea, when everybody is singing and dancing, the celebration that they have escaped Egypt and their enemies have been vanquished. And she comes out and she is singing and dancing at the sea. So here we're going to see immediately a connection between Miriam and water. And it's striking also, and I mentioned this last time, that immediately after the death of Miriam, we find there is no water, right? Water is something that you take for granted unless you don't have it. And then it becomes overwhelming. You need it, right? You can live without food for a while. You can't really live without water very long. And so the people are really pressed. And we have that legend of the well, which accompanied the people of Israel along the journey to honor Miriam, right? Because of her merit, and now the well dries up. And as I suggested last time, also that sometimes people are taken for granted until they're no longer there. I want to suggest something else today, and that is that somehow the presence of Miriam in some way that isn't so explicit even to the people has a stabilizing effect on the camp. Just her being there, something about her. We're told she's referred to at the sea as a prophetess, right? We don't really know what her role is, and that's striking, right? Miriam Haniviyah, Miriam the prophetess. It seems that there is some role that she plays, not an explicit one, perhaps not even a public one. And when she dies, there is something missing. And in the wake of that, things are much more difficult. And they are much more difficult for Moses. Because Moses is not just his sister, she has been his protector from all the way back from his infancy. She's the one who looked out for her younger brother, right? Moses has been beset by complaints, by rebellions, right? And there was even a moment when she spoke against him. But here, she's gone. And one sees his life, his support constricting. And by the end of this scene, Aaron's going to be gone too. He's really going to be alone. At any rate, at this moment, immediately after the death of Miriam, the community is without water, and they join up against Moses and Aaron, and they quarrel with them, right? Vayarev, they dispute them, they quarrel with them. If only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance of the Lord, right? We should have died before. And here the reference is probably to the death of the Korach and his followers, that whole rebellion. And the thing was that they died quickly. They had, the earth swallowed Korach up, done, finished. But they are destined here now to death by thirst, slow, painful, right? And they imagine here, it would have been better just to die. Why have you brought the Lord's congregation? And here it's not God who brought them. You brought us. Why did you bring us to die in this wilderness, us and our animals? Why did you make us leave Egypt, bring us to this wretched place with no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates? There is not even water to drink, right? Nothing. Not only don't we have lush fruit, right? Now remember, they are getting manna, but it's not enough to sustain them. So not only do we have this, this boring, miserable food, but we have no water, right? And you have this sense of, figs and vines and pomegranates, right? The stuff that the scouts brought back, that sort of lushness of the land. And Moses and Aaron come away from the congregation to the entrance to the tent of meeting. So they leave, right? And they come to the entrance, and now God is going to instruct them what to do. I want to ask you, now I want to jump back. There's another scene, was mentioned last time, but we didn't really look at it, which in some ways parallels this. In fact, we're going to see the name that the place is given here is very similar to the name there. That took place right after the people came out of Egypt, at the very beginning of their journey. And if you turn back, it's chapter 17 of the book of Exodus. And I think it's really, in order to understand what we have here, we have to look back there and look at the differences. So chapter 17 of Exodus, beginning with verse 1. If you have the Eitz Chaim, it's on page 419. And you know what? I'm going to just give you a chance before we go through this. If anyone has a question, I've opened to the gallery view. Yeah, go ahead, Hannah. Unmute, please. You have to unmute. Hannah, you're muted.
Yeah, this was my Torah reading 2 weeks ago. That's exactly, I was going to ask you, why is it echoed? Why does it then come on later in Numbers? I was going to ask that.
Yes, right.
So I read.
Right. So you can see it's extremely similar. I won't ask you to chant it for us. I'm sure you could. Any other questions here up to here, the death of Miriam or the setup for this scene? Oh, okay, so if not, we're going to go back. I'll go back to the speaker view, and let's look at chapter 17 of Exodus. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole Israelite community continued by stages as the Lord would command. They encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water. The people quarreled with Moses, same verb. Give us water to drink, they said. And Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you try the Lord? But the people thirsted for water, and they grumbled against Moses, saying, why did you bring us up from Egypt to kill us, our children, and our livestock with thirst? Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do with this people? Before long, they will be stoning me. Right, so here, and we're not going to see this in the book of Numbers, here, Moses literally is afraid for his life. He is here an untested leader, having just led them out of Egypt. He's going to now have to travel through the promised land, and he's afraid. And the Lord said to Moses, pass before the people, take some of the elders of Israel, take along the rod with which you struck the Nile, and set out. I will be, so he's going to take representatives of the people, the elders, right? And they're going to go with Moses, and God will be standing there on the rock at Horeb. I'll be right with you. I'll be there. And Moses is told, strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink. And Moses does it in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place is called Massa and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tried God, saying, is the Lord present among us or not? Right? So it's a very short story. Moses is afraid. God's there with him. God tells him, strike the rock. He strikes the rock. Water comes out. What we're going to see now is a different version taking place much later, right after the death of Miriam, after several rebellions. And it looks like the same story, but it really isn't in significant ways. Okay, so back to our text. We are Numbers chapter 20. We are continuing. We'll just read back to verse 2, what the people said. They quarrel with Moses. If only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance of the Lord. Why have you brought us to this place to die here? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Bring us to this wretched place, right? By the way, Moses made them leave, right? Again, this idealized vision of Egypt where, you blew it for us. There's not even water to drink. So Moses and Aaron come away from the congregation to the entrance of the tent. No sense that they are being threatened. Moses here is not talking about how they're going to stone him. Right? They go to the tent of meeting. They go to this place where Moses meets with God, right? And fall on their faces. And God's presence appears. And God says to Moses, okay, here's what you do. You and your brother Aaron take the rod, right? Notice this rod is not described in the same way. It's the same rod, but there it is made clear that was the rod that did the miracles. Moses would lift up his staff from beginning to end. He would use it over the Nile, lift it up even over the sea as it split. Here, we don't get a reference to that. Just take the rod. This is a rod which apparently is stored in this tent of meeting. Right? It's not something that Moses walks around with all the time. And it's not something, remember, this is a different generation, right? This is largely a generation growing up now in the wilderness. We'll see in a minute that they're getting ready to go into the land. So we have a whole new generation. This rod has been kept away. They don't entirely know what it is. Moses is supposed to take the rod and assemble the community, and before their eyes, order the rock to yield its water. Right? So not hit the rock with the staff, not use the staff apparently as some kind of magic, right? An instrument to create this, this miracle. Just hold it, stand there and speak to the rock, which, by the way, much more impressive if you think about it, right? It's one thing to hit the rock and water comes out, right? You did something and something happened. Here, just say, rock, give us water. Or rock, God commands you, let us have water, or whatever Moses is supposed to say. So what God is telling him to do is really dramatically different. On the other hand, while the people have not experienced the new generation, what happened before, Moses has. And one can imagine Moses going into a kind of default mode. Oh, yeah, I remember this. Yeah, I take the rod, I go hit the rock. Yeah, right? Without really paying attention to the subtlety here. So what does he do? He assembles the congregation in front of the rock, and he says, listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? Now, in the other case, he didn't say anything. At least we don't know that he said anything. He just went and took the rock. Here, quite different. Here he is speaking, and he was told, right? If you look back a few verses, you will order the rock to yield its water. So who was he supposed to speak to? The rock. Who is he actually speaking to? The people. And what does he say? First of all, he calls them a name, right? He says, you are rebels. Right? That is, by coming to me and saying you're thirsty, you are in rebellion. Okay? Not so clear. I mean, they're kvetchers. I don't know if they're rebels, you know. By the way, I can't help but, you'll forgive me my political aside, but this idea that, you know, the attack on the Capitol was just a legitimate political disagreement, right? Which is how the Republicans in Congress have, right? And, right. So here, right, this does seem more minor than an out and out rebellion. Of course, Moses has been conditioned by this. He has seen rebellion after rebellion, and he is quick to interpret the people's complaining, right? Which, by the way, they're blaming on him. They're not saying, why isn't God giving us water? They're saying, hey, this is your fault. You were the one who let us out. And so, listen, you rebels, and shimu na, right? So shimu is hearken. You know, it's very strong, although it is modified by the word na, which means please. Please. Right? So it's not quite. And then he says, Hamin hasela hazen notzi lechem, water. From this rock, can we bring you water? And this is a very significant difference, because Moses here is making it about himself and Aaron, right? Can we do this? Like this, it would be really something. If we could do this, you probably think it's impossible, right? So it's about Moses. And Moses has just been attacked, right? In the sense, why did you, Moses, bring us out, right? Moses was the one who brought us out. And now Moses is picking up on that. And he's saying, you think we can do this? Aaron and I. And what does he do? He raises his hand. And notice that we're getting now, this is kind of, last time we weren't told that Moses raised his hand. It's very cinematic, if you think about it. There is this act which we're capturing, not just Moses hit the rock. Moses raised his hand and then hits it twice. I'm reminded a little bit here of very different context, very different meaning. But if you remember the story of the Akedah, how God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, he walks for 3 days, he comes to the mountain, Isaac is bound, and then the text says, and Abraham took the knife and raised his hand, at which point the angel comes through and says, don't do that. That's not what I want. God just wanted your loyalty. God doesn't want you to kill your son, and so on. But there's something cinematic. It's like time slows down as we're being drawn to this act. He raises his hand, and then not just does he strike the rock, but he strikes it twice. And one gets the sense, given this context, given the language, that Moses is really angry. Really angry. He can't take it out on the people, so he's taking it out on the rock, right? This is much more than just speak to the rock. Right? There's a wonderful statement in the Talmud that says, when a scholar is angry, he forgets his Torah. When a prophet is angry, he loses his prophecy. Right? There's something about anger that blinds you, that you lose yourself in it. You lose your faculties. You lash out, right? And here, it doesn't say, in fairness, it doesn't say that Moses's anger grew but if you look at the scene and you look at the way it's described, and I'm particularly struck by the fact he hits the rock twice. Twice. Even not what he did the first time. So you could say, well, he's just on automatic pilot. But the first time he didn't call them names. He only hit it once. My image of the first time is he taps the rock. Like a magician, he takes the staff, he touches the rock, the water flows out. Here it's very different. The scene is very different, but they get their water. Not only water for the people, but water for their animals. They are given what they asked for. But there are going to be consequences. Consequences for Moses and for Aaron. Okay, and let's look at that in verse 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, you will not lead this congregation into the land that I have given you, right? So they are going to be punished in a very severe way. Moses does not get to enter the promised land, and Aaron will die fairly soon. Right? Moses will die on the edge of the promised land. It does seem like an extreme reaction on God's part. It seems unjust if one thinks about it. Moses, who didn't want the job, no, send someone else. God says, I'll be with you. Moses, who has had the difficulties of leading these people, who has come to near despair, who God said, okay, I'll give you some help, right? Stuck with it, argued with God when God wanted to destroy the people, right? All the greatness that we've seen. And now God says, hey, I told you to speak to the rock. You hit the rock, you're done, right? So what do we make of this if we're going to say that God is just and merciful? Right? So I want to give you a variety of suggestions, and then we'll open it up for any comments and discussion. So one is that Moses really has lost the ability to lead. It's not so much a punishment as it is God's acknowledgement of the fact that Moses really is not up to the challenges ahead. And that Moses sees complaints as complaints against him. Moses is busy defending himself and not God, right? Moses was supposed to, God is saying, sanctify the people, right? Sanctify God in the mouths of, in the minds of the people. So the expression here is lo hit kadisheni, right? You have not made me holy, you have not sanctified me. The expression we often talk about with respect to this is called Kiddush Hashem, right? Literally sanctifying the name, but really sanctifying God. How do you do Kiddush Hashem in its most extreme example? You give up your life for God, right? That's Kiddush Hashem, martyrdom, which, by the way, our tradition doesn't really command, except in certain very, very limited and extraordinary cases. But the idea is, I'll give you one example. You know, if someone says, kill him or I'll kill you, you're not supposed to commit murder, even if it means taking your own life. God demands that of us. We are sanctifying God by doing that, right? The idea is that you, if they say you can't keep kosher, you keep kosher anyway, right? You try to keep kosher. This sanctifies God. But here, somehow this act, when Moses spoke to the rock, was supposed to somehow enhance God's sanctity, enhance God's reputation. And Moses made it all about himself, and God is not sanctified. Will we be able to do this, right? It's all about him. God isn't sanctified, and he's not going to be the right guy for the future. Ultimately, they're going to have to fight their way into the promised land. They're all going to have to be united around the leader, who it turns out will be Joshua. And Moses isn't the right guy. And Moses will have to invest his authority in Joshua, which he'll do right before he dies. So we get this sense of Moses acting in anger. We have a sense that he doesn't quite grasp the people who are before him and the needs of the moment. He's lost any sense of sympathy for the people, empathy for the people, who, after all, are thirsty, right? I mean, they are, one has a sense, in fairly dire straits. And God, by the way, God does not say anything about them being rebels. God says, okay, here's what you do. Go, speak to the rock, and they'll get their water, right? But Moses feels this very personally. And then I want to add one more dimension. Miriam's death, right? He's just lost his sister. He's not himself in some ways. So for, I think, a whole variety of reasons, Moses is no longer the guy to lead the people. Now, that leaves us with a question, which we'll come to shortly. What is so bad about Aaron in all of this? Why? Moses is the one who calls the rebels, right? Moses is the one. And yet God says to Moses and Aaron, you didn't trust me, you didn't sanctify me, and therefore you, both of you, are not going to go into the promised land. It's ironic that the last time we saw Aaron together with someone was Aaron and Miriam who were complaining about Moses. They were both doing it, but Miriam got punished and Aaron seems to have gotten a pass. Here, where Aaron is not doing anything, he too is going to be punished for what happened here. So we'll come to the death of Aaron before too long, but we have a little story to come in between. And before we do that, I'm going to open it up. And I'm interested in your thoughts, comments, questions. Just unmute and ask. So, okay, Hannah first, go ahead.
Yeah, so quite a bit of time has elapsed between the two occurrences, if not
Yes.
40 years, right?
Yes.
The first time, God said he would be standing before him by the rock. At this time, he just said, gather the people. So he
Yes.
would be alone.
Yeah,
He
and
was no
that
alone.
is a striking difference. And it's worth noting.
That's a good pun, a striking difference.
Yeah. An unintended pun, I guarantee you, but it is quite a difference. And when it says God would stand before him, not clear whether the people have a sense of God there at the rock, or whether somehow Moses is being told, hey, it's me and not the staff. I'm not sure. But yes, thanks for pointing that out. It's a real difference. Other comments, questions? Maureen, just unmute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
So like how many generations of people were there between these two?
Right. So it's, we don't get a date stamp here. So we don't know. But from what we're going to see in a minute, right, it's 40 years more, really, because we're told with the incident of the scouts, where Moses sends these scouts into the land to prepare the people for conquest. And as a result, I'm not going to rehash the story, but as a result, God says that that whole generation will die out, right? And a new generation will go into the land. So how much time elapsed between the Exodus itself and now coming to the edge of the land of Israel where that happens? Probably not all that long, maybe less than a year, right? But now it's 40 years later. And we know that because the story we're about to read is Moses asking for permission on the edge of the promised land. He's going to go in, the people are going to go in, but he has to pass through the territory of Edom. Edom is just to the east of the Dead Sea and heading down. He's going to come in from that in that direction, heading west, right? So I think it's reasonable to surmise that 40 years have passed, 2 generations. What the old generation has certainly died out. More than that, hard to say. In the Bible in general, a generation is usually thought to be 20 years.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean a whole generation dies out in 20 years and a whole new generation comes in. And of course, the people who went out were of various ages as well. So, but average mortality, was much, much lower than it is today.
Right.
Okay, good. Barry.
So in Exodus chapter 17, and my version, so the place is called Massah and Meribah.
Yes, sort of a hyphenated name.
And
And
then
here it is both.
Meribah. So these
Right, so the two
are different, are they different places?
Well,
And
okay,
presumably different places
so
with a similar
they
name?
they seem to be different places because one is on the edge of the promise. It's also, I never thought about this, but if you think about it, they bookend the period in the wilderness in some, or at least the transverse of the wilderness, right? One is when they first enter, and here it is when they are getting ready to leave, right? So I don't think it's the same place, but they get similar names. Not quite the same name, but similar names. So, and you could certainly make a case that there are places that have the same name or similar names. We see that, you know, how many new towns are there in this country, right? You know, how many main streets are there? That kind of thing, right? Could be that. Of course, biblical scholars, contemporary biblical scholars, some want to suggest that this is really the same story, right? It's been recast, remember that from the point of view of modern biblical scholarship, the Torah is a collection of documents that have been edited together, which represent different traditions, right? Perhaps we have here two different traditions of the same event. Even saying that, though, you have to look at them in their context, and you have to be aware of the differences, and you have to be aware of the editor, whoever put this together, from the point of view of, you know, modern scholarship, who they call the redactor, right? Why the redactor kept both of them, why the redactor puts one at the beginning of the Exodus and one at the end. So I don't think it's reasonable just to say, to me anyway, oh yeah, well, we have the same story here, it just takes two forms. Maybe true, but there's a whole lot more going on, and I think it's absolutely reasonable, and in fact, more than reasonable, important to contrast the two and not just say, okay, we have two different versions of the story. One, you know, it's like a game of telephone, you know, one came down in this version and the other came down in that version. We're going to see something, and Barrett, I'll come back to you in a second. We're going to see something, well, if you look, you can see, we're not going to get to the book of Deuteronomy. I'll be happy we get through all of Numbers. But in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is retelling the events to this new generation of what came before. And there are significant differences between what Moses says, and to give you one example, the story of the scouts. According to the story here, it was God who told Moses, send the scouts. When Moses retells it, it was the people who insisted that Moses send the scouts, right? We have two very different versions. And you could say, well, these are two different versions of the same story. Or you could say, which I think is much more interesting, Moses is retelling the story in a specific way because he has in mind throughout that book of Deuteronomy, which is really a long speech recounting the events of the past for the generation that's going into the land. He is shading it in particular ways because he wants them to see it in a certain way. He wants them to see a sense that they were responsible. And I could make the argument they were, by the way, but that they were responsible because it will be a cautionary tale to them when they move forward. So you can take either point of view. I think there's tremendous value in modern scholarship, really remarkable value in some ways. I also think that it sometimes can be just too easy to say, oh, these are the same stories and move on without really appreciating the subtle differences and sometimes the profound differences. And also to take the view of the modern scholars, why the redactor put them together the way they were put together. Okay. Barry, were you going to say one other thing?
Yes, so here in the book of Numbers, the people reference the event where their brothers fell dead.
Yes.
Before the Lord, so this would follow.
Right.
That event.
Right. So if you were a modern scholar who wants to say these are two stories, this is the more complete story, right? And maybe the one right after the Exodus is transposed back there. But yes, right here, it's not saying, the complaint at the beginning is, better we would have died in Egypt. right? That was the complaint for a long time. Now it's better we would have died in the wilderness suddenly, right? So, yes, other comments, questions, Sandy? Yeah, okay, well, go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, just as in attempt to explain some of this by natural causes. You know, are there places in the desert, in the wilderness, where the water does
Okay,
flow from
so,
rocks?
yeah, so not
Or
quite.
appear to, or appear
Not,
so?
not quite. You know, and I always, I mean, the Bible, it's the Torah itself is not interested in naturalistic explanations, right? Because, and one of the things about the plagues is that what begins in a way which seems like, well, the Egyptian magicians could do it. Also, we can imagine very naturalistic explanations for example, the plague of blood. Many people have pointed out that there's such a thing as a red tide and it kills fish and so on. So, right, by the end of the plagues, what we have is things that, you know, there's a plague of darkness, but only on the Egyptian homes. The Israelite homes are fine. The slaying of the firstborn, the Egyptian firstborn, but somehow the Israelite firstborn, they're fine, right? So you from the point of view of the Torah, naturalistic explanations, even if we could sort of come up with one, are beside the point. Now, having said that, there is certainly a phenomena in the desert. Their rainstorms are very infrequent, right? And the desert here is not like the Gobi Desert, right? Where it's just sand, right? There are oases, there are areas, there's some rain, very little. And there is at times flash flooding. It could be terrible in Israel. People die, I think, every year where they go hiking in these, what are essentially dry riverbeds, and there's a storm and the water comes rushing through and no one anticipated it and so on. So yeah, there are times where you think there's no water and suddenly there's an abundance of water. But the idea that it's going to come out of a rock, I mean, the only thing you could say is, well, there was some kind of natural spring, but they didn't notice it. And then they came there and then they saw it. But I don't, you know, I don't think that's the story. Other comments? I know, yeah, Sandy.
So Rabbi, the part where Moses said, "You rebels,"
Yeah.
could it be at all related to the line where, I think the sentence, "Would that," when they said, "Would that we had perished when our brethren perished before the Lord," you know, with Korach. So it could be relating them to Korach.
Yes, but
They're
with
rebels.
Korach, right? Yeah, but they're real rebels. They are real rebels, right? They are attacking Moses. There's, you know, they want to. It's an insurrection, right? It is, right? Here, you've got a bunch of people complaining, and part of the way people complain is by using hyperbolic language. You know, I just wanted to die. You know, it's very different in tone and in feeling. If you go back and look at Korach and the, you know, this challenge, right, to depose Moses and Aaron, that's not this. There's been a history of it. I think Moses views this through the lens of that. Yet another attack on him and Aaron, right? But I don't think what the people say, as described here, justifies calling them rebels. I don't. It seems very, very strong. And if you couple that with hitting the rock twice, right? And you couple that with his extreme vitriolic language, I think they're not rebels. God doesn't call them rebels. They're not punished, right? We've seen rebellions that were they're not punished. They get their water. It's just they don't get it in the way God told them, right? God wants to give them, by the way, God could have had it not work, right? I told you to speak to the rock. You hit the rock, right? It doesn't happen. One has a sense here that God, the people are thirsty. For whatever reason it's gotten to this point, that's another question. But God wants to give them water. Okay. Something further. Go ahead.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so when Moses says, "Hear now, ye rebels, are we to bring you forth water out of this rock?" So two points. One, can the we be referring to God and Moses? And then the second question is, because Moses hit it once and Aaron didn't stop him on the second one,
Right.
would that be
right.
why
So-
Aaron is?
Right. So that is when we see when we try to figure out why Aaron dies, that's one of the classic explanations of the commentary.
Okay.
Right. Aaron should have interceded. He didn't intercede, and therefore he is culpable. Right. Absolutely. To your first point, it all seems right. So the picture, the scene is Moses and Aaron come away. They fall on their face. God tells them what to do. And then Moses takes the rod. Moses and Aaron assemble the congregation in front of the rock. And he says, Moses and Aaron have assembled. Shall we get it? It's very big stretch. If that's what Moses meant, all the circumstances would not lead me as one of those people to think that. If Moses said, can God do this? As God's instrument, can I do this? You might be able to suggest we. Here, I just don't see it. Right? And remember that it's not just Moses has been attacked. If you look at the Korach story, it's about Aaron too, right? They were attacked together. Aaron's role as the high priest had to be reinforced. We had the story with the rods and only Aaron's rod, right? So to the extent that this is viewed in Moses's mind as an attack, it's very logical to think that it's an attack on both him and his brother. And then add another psychological dimension. They were a triad and they lost their sister, right? So now it's the two of them, right? Again, I think we is, it's a stretch. I'd love to try to salvage Moses here. And God clearly doesn't think that. In fact, God says exactly the opposite. That's not what you would do. Okay. Any other questions? We're going to leave it with this story because we're just about out of time. But if Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to note the fact that it was several generations from when it first started. They have very little memory of Egypt, if any.
Right. That's a good point, right? So for them, it's not why, we'd rather go back to Egypt. It's all about the desert. This is a generation that grew up in the desert. This is what they know, right? So what do they know? We've been in this desert. It's a lousy place, I mean, yeah, they do seem to know something about fruit, right? But it's not a good place. And so their complaint is, we're here and we don't even have water. And they've lost sight, right? They've lost sight of where they come from, right? And this is the alternative to something that's much worse.
Mhm.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? So I will see you all next week, where we're going to start with looking at this little story about how the Israelites attempt to make their way to the promised land, going through the territory of Edom. and how they are thwarted from doing that. And of course, then the death of Aaron, and then we'll move on from there. So great to see you all. Have a good week, and I will see you next week.